All right, welcome everyone to the fourth of 6 webinars that the Center for Media Literacy is conducting in conjunction with NATO, exploring resilience through media literacy to help create a dialogue between NATO personnel and media literacy researchers and practitioners. Our topics in the series have already included propaganda, mental health, and social media, as well as news literacy, with education systems and NATO delegations and media literacy in government still to come later this week. Today's webinar will be highlighting experience from the COVID-19 pandemic, dangers of disinformation in world health crises, as well as health communication as it relates to media literacy. I'm Monica Hanley, an associate at the Center for Media Literacy, and before we start, I'd like to introduce the rest of our wonderful panel for today. First, we have Dr. Vlasta Zekulic, who was commissioned in 2002 as an infantry officer for the Croatian Armed Forces, and has worked in the strategic assessment element in the Emergency Security Challenges Division at NATO HQ, initiating, developing, and drafting strategic assessments to identify emerging crises, enhance situational awareness, and provide early warning for the NATO Secretary General and the Chairman of the Military Committee. Dr. Zekulic has completed 2 tours of Afghanistan and is currently the branch head of strategic issues and engagements at Supreme Allied Command Transformation. So welcome, Dr. Zekulic. We also have Dr. Barb, a senior scientist at Klein, Buendel, and who is also a professor of communication and the associate chair of the Department of Communication at University of Colorado, Denver. Dr. Walkosz focuses on skin cancer, health communication and education, social marketing, media literacy, and civility. So welcome, Dr. Walkosz. And we also have Dr. Solvita Denisa-Liepniece, an associate professor at Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences in Latvia, and serves as the country expert for several international organizations focused on media literacy and information resilience in the Baltic countries, and is the Disinformation Resilience Advisor at the Baltic Center for Media Excellence. So thank you to the 3 of you and the audience as well for joining us today. Dr. Zekulic, let's begin the webinar with you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good morning from Norfolk, Virginia. So I'll hit it like where it hurts. So when the pandemic started, you will not be surprised that NATO was not prepared, just like the rest of the world, but us even less so than the others. But what happened immediately, like once we saw the magnitude that the pandemic might actually have, was to launch into the crisis mode. And that's what NATO can do. So we immediately established so-called Crisis Management Task Force for COVID-19. And we try to make sense of what's happening and what we as the military alliance can do about the health crisis. Like I say, this is not something that goes naturally or easy to us. And we have identified 3 main lines of work, like on what do we as the NATO, as the military political alliance can actually, or should be even looking into. And the first big part, the first important part was to understand like what impact will COVID have on our own troops, on our own ability to deter and defend the Euro-Atlantic area. So that was the first. How can we do our job in the times of pandemic? The big pillar number 2 is to try to use our foresight analysis in understanding how can we anticipate what's coming next. So what from this crisis that goes across what we call the DIME spectrum: diplomatic, information, military, political, legal, societal, and so on. And the third important pillar was, how do we communicate about this? How do we understand what is the impact? What are people expecting from us and what we can actually do for them? So these were 3 big pillars. Let me first just cover the 2 first big ones, and then I'll focus for the most of my brief on the third one. But the first one, if you think in the spring of 2020, we were supposed to have the most mightiest, biggest NATO military exercise program since the Cold War. 100,000 troops on the borders, basically exercising the whole east flanks, connecting the maritime and air and land. We finally got to the point. We were supposed to do the first one ever, big military exercise called Defender Europe, where Americans with something like 50,000 troops would actually go across the Atlantic, land into Europe, spread through Europe, go to the east. It was supposed to be grand and big, and we are back in the game. Obviously, it did not happen. So we had to understand, like, okay, if we cannot do what we plan to do, you might recall that the whole crew of two carriers, one French, one American, got COVID and they were completely decommissioned. We can't pull the land exercises. So we have to reinvent, how do we do deterrence and defense when we can't be together? And luckily, some of our air assets help with that. So that was the first thing, like, how can we do this? And obviously, we wanted to protect the troops, but on the other side, people expect that in times of crisis, military steps up and they have to help. So we had to identify what tools do we have, what skills do we have that can actually help our civil societies in managing this crisis. Obviously, two things we are really, really good at. One is logistics, and second, command and control. So what we could do is basically try to harness the totality of NATO military structure to build hospitals, to move shipments around. We activated our aircrafts, our transports, our command and control system, like how can we manage better and then move things around. So those were kind of, and we even created a military plan where the enemy line in the plan was virus. And it was the first time and probably the only time in NATO we're going to see the enemy forces being the literally the virus itself. So that was on one pillar. Second pillar was, how can we anticipate how this is going to play out and basically look into the strategic functions. What are other organizations doing? What are the long-term implications? And part of this was, for example, like, how will this impact defense budgets? Because obviously in times of health crisis, we are obviously all funded from the government, like, centralized pot of money. So understanding how much resources the countries will have to spend towards the health will obviously go to the most likely the detriment of the defense spending. So we have to understand, like, put some thinking around that as well. And then also the part of it was to understand how we can be targeted. Where are the new vulnerabilities? So obviously for NATO as military alliance, we constantly look at ourselves, where are the vulnerabilities of our system through which adversaries can attack. And we don't just look at the military vulnerabilities, we look across the whole societies, because from what NATO calls so-called the hybrid warfare and hybrid threats, the enemy will always try to exploit all the weaknesses in our system in order to attack and disrupt and break us from within. So we had to understand, how is now COVID creating new vulnerabilities, new gaps in our defense systems, new gaps or new, like, cracks in what we thought was very coherent alliance in order to exploit it. So these two pillars, like I say, how do we continue doing our job and protect our troops? How do we then understand what this means for future? And all of it was actually reflected in the third and the last pillars, what's happening in the information domain. And there are three things in here that was immediately ripping us and hitting us in the head. First was ability for our adversaries, and here I think primarily China and Russia, to turn everything we were doing against us. So there were like this whole flurry of myths that was launched. Like, first, NATO created the COVID virus. Second, that we deliberately spread it through our exercise program. Third, that we actually are failing to help allies fight it. Fourth, that we are stealing the money away from the health for defense by creating crisis. So everything we tried doing was in the media space turned against us, and we had to react. However, our adversaries were extremely, let's try to call it, shrewd, and they know that the best way to hamper our ability to address anything in the media space is to create, like, launch coherent campaigns. And when you launch these information or disinformation or misinformation campaigns across several nations, then particularly it becomes very difficult to address. So I'll give you just one example from that period just to illustrate what we had to deal with. But over the period of just 2 days, and we are talking about 20th and 21st April of 2020, so about a month after we started with our crisis management response to COVID, in 3 Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, we had like a simultaneous attack. So over just those 2 days, first, there was this alleged letter by Secretary General to Lithuanian Prime Minister saying that basically NATO is so disappointed the way the country is handling a crisis, and we will pull all our troops out. Second, in the same day, in the Latvia, there was a big expose going through like this fake interview, basically saying how all the Canadian troops in Latvia are deliberately spreading COVID among the people. And then the third one was there was this forged letter by the Polish military leaders, I think it was Deputy Chief of General Staff, basically criticizing the US troops in the country. So basically you see like one cluster of nations very important to NATO suddenly being like flooded by forges, by fake personalities, falsehood, amplification, everything that NATO is doing something, these letters are flying up. So for us to understand what's happening in each country and realize this is all single orchestrated disinformation campaign across the whole theater in order to destabilize it, to call the people to doubt us, to doubt their leaders, to doubt our the commitment to them, to assure them that we are here for them, not against them, was something we had to dismantle. So like for every almost a campaign, you will understand that it was, like I say, just one in the series of the campaigns that were launched against us. But NATO, from that perspective, decided to have a very coherent response that was based on two main pillars. One is understand, and second is engage. And understanding meant how do we as NATO actually able to map the whole information environment? How are we able to track and trace every single piece of understanding of news, of the tweet, of a post, of a bot, like to see where it's actually going, to understand what is this something that just like one off, or it's actually something going to flare up that we have to understand, like we have to actually manage. So understanding how it can be anything that we do can be used against us, and how we can protect, and then engage. And here engage, I mean like a twofold. Again, we do like everything is sword trace. That's how NATO does. But for us, the two main avenue was one, how do we assure allies that we are here for them? So messaging directly to our allies. And then second, messaging to advertise to our adversaries, no, you won't. And this is that strong deterrence and defense posture that we were able to launch. So every time they would come up with something, we were out there basically demystifying them, debunking their stuff, putting it on the NATO website and stuff. But we also realized this is still very reactive. So we decided also to build the third pillar, which was how to preempt. How do we actually better prepare our audiences so they would not be so susceptible to this misinformation, particularly regarding the virus? So we did kind of like 3-4 things. So first was like to understand what could be used. So proactive communications. When we knew there's something happening that could be like used or tweaked or like abused, we were actually massively communicating in advance to prepare our audiences. This is coming. This will be, you can maybe expect for this to be reacted to it, but this is not the case. So we were basically trying to have this whole narrative played out. So for people, when they hear it was from us, it would not be surprised when they heard it from somebody else. Second thing was like obviously flagging the common sources of disinformation. We were always like already monitoring like all the standard sources, all the news sources and stuff like that. So flagging, if the information is coming from this source, think twice, basically, particularly if it makes you angry or it makes you afraid, because those are the most marketable feelings. So angry or afraid, and this source, basically ignore it. The third thing was obviously reporting and being very proactive in reporting every time we would caught these things. But last and not least, and I think everybody will understand, we had to pick our battles. At one point, there were so many of them that actually chasing behind every piece of information was futile. We were just like dispersing our resources that were limited as is, because we had to protect ourselves as well from COVID. We were getting sick as well. So choosing the battles to fight, attacking the main starters of the fire, and being able to communicate proactively, deliberately, and to the point, truly when necessary, became like the core of what we've done. So I think from this, like a short opening remarks, you can see that like basically NATO, although we can be slow, but also in terms of COVID, we were quite fast to adapt and use all our strengths to help the allies do this. We were also really trying to be agile, to understand, to use our knowledge of information domain, communication, strategic communications, to understand where the new vulnerability is being created, how can they be exploited by adversaries, and then which ones of them do we have to fight actually in the information domain, and which we actually just have to fight by doing our job and being what we truly are. And in many ways, this approach became like a standard of how NATO nowadays deals with disinformation in general, and we are applying it no matter what. But it all started very bluntly, very simply, within a month of us having to deal with COVID-19 and the impact it has on the alliance. I will stop now, and obviously more than happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was very insightful and a great example of how governments and how organizations had to react super quickly and respond, not just react to this kind of chaos environment that was created. So very interesting. Thank you so much. And Dr. Barb Walkosz, let's turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. I wanted to share my screen and let's see. Am I sharing?
Yes.
Okay, let me, oh, I see what I need to. I see it's this is, sorry about this. Just do this. There we go. The little, there we are. Thank you very much. Thank you for that insightful talk, Dr. Zekulic, and I'll follow with some comments to start the conversation based on my perspective and research perspectives on how media literacy can also add to help create resilience, particularly during the public health crisis that we did experience and are actually continuing to experience. So again, as you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the most severe public health crises in the last 100 years. But simultaneously, we also experienced this infodemic. And this was really an exposure to an unprecedented amount of information that we have ever seen. And the infodemic contained actually both public health recommendations, but of more greater concern was misinformation about the virus, which Dr. Zekulic previously talked about. And of concern about misinformation is the fact that it's often false, inaccurate, misleading, and potentially very dangerous, both to individual health and obviously to country defenses. And I think as a result of both the pandemic and the infodemic, new dimensions of global crisis communication emerged, particularly, and I'm going to focus mainly on citizens, as individuals used their digital devices to engage with the tsunami of information that was coming at them. I'll focus a bit first on social media, then I'm going to turn to media literacy. Just to put it into context, when we look at the most recent data on global social media use, Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp have about 2 billion users. Instagram sits at 1.2 billion, and TikTok, QQ, Douyin, and Sino Weibo all have north of 500 million users per site. Putting that into perspective, with that use during the pandemic has implications for how we communicate across these social media platforms. I wanted to take a moment to consider the dual nature of social media and particularly how it played out during the COVID-19 pandemic. Social media has a lot of benefits, right? The internet and social media are widely used to access health information really on a daily basis now. And during the pandemic, it provided critical health information about vaccines, non-pharmaceutical interventions like hand washing, mask wearing, social distancing, local and national policies about the pandemic itself. And again, these platforms are flexible, responsive, and accessible. They're very nimble, where we can use social media to respond and again, rebut misinformation, bring new information to our audiences. They can also, and this, I think this is also important, can increase social support because we're talking often peer-to-peer, family-to-family, motivate collective action, and respond to emerging issues. But as we all know, there are a lot of challenges, and these challenges emerged, I think, a lot during the pandemic. The social media disseminated misinformation widely about vaccine safety, about conspiracy theories. Yes, they often said that it was the government or NATO that was dispersing the pandemic throughout the populations. They promoted pseudoscience treatments like ingesting disinfectants to cure the virus, talked about the lack of severity of the virus. It's just like the flu, and often gave us misinformation about how it spreads through houseflies and mosquitoes, for example. So given that kind of information, unfortunately, very few people still verify information online. And we found that recent research found that misinformation during the COVID pandemic really decreased trust in experts, whether it be health or political experts. We trusted them less as misinformation increased. And finally, in spite of the fact that social media platforms have been trying to reduce information, gatekeepers are often absent information can fill through into social media. And the last point I want to make about the challenges, and we know that there are a lot of fact-checking programs and they can often be very successful. But again, recent research has found that these fact-checking programs can be ephemeral and can often just be short-lived and don't carry through as we are exposed to future media. So I guess the question that, see if I can get, that we need to ask ourselves is, what can we do to capitalize on the benefits and address these challenges? Well, media literacy programs have been effective across a wide range of health topics: smoking cessation, nutrition education, alcohol advertising, violence reduction. I want to share with you some recent research about media literacy and the COVID-19 pandemic. One recent survey found that individuals who had media literacy knowledge about both source and content of information, this knowledge predicted adoption of protective behaviors during COVID-19. Another study found that a need for cognition, kind of a key concept in media literacy, was negatively associated with misperceptions about COVID-19. And the last study that I'll cite is that researchers found that media literacy actually provided really this kind of, I like this term, this effective cognitive shield against misinformation. Media literacy really arms, so to speak, the individual with the skills to recognize and actually debunk misinformation. So I guess what I wanted to do today was kind of offer media literacy as a strategy for pandemic health communication. And I think we can think of it in two ways. The first strategy would be long-term, right? So that countries with systematic and sustainable media literacy education programs can provide a strong foundation for their citizens, that they're ready to face that kind of tsunami of information that comes at them, no matter what the context is, right? It could be a pandemic, it could be political information in their own country, but they're ready to assess that information. And then I think the second strategy, which Dr. Zekulic talked about a bit, was that media literacy education can also happen during a pandemic, that we can use media literacy immediately to debunk false information, that we can actually teach citizens how to respond to that information on the spot. It's an agile, responsive strategy, really. One recent study showed that a short media literacy intervention delivered over social media decreased the perceived accuracy of false news content. And meta-analysis has shown that social media can effectively correct misinformation. And in this study, it was when misinformation was distributed by a news information source and that it was debunked by experts. So we have evidence now showing that debunking information can really help us fight against the disinformation and misinformation campaigns. I wanted to share with you that our research team during COVID-19, we conducted, kind of based on existing research, we conducted a short social media campaign with 300 participants. Our campaign started right when the vaccine was released, so we were facing a lot of information about the risks of vaccine hesitancy, campaigns trying to encourage individuals not to get vaccinated, obviously. But what we did in our study was our messages were posted over a 9-week period across conditions that manipulated the source. So we manipulated the source by, was it from the government? Was it from peers, or was it from a news organization? And our post included information on non-pharmaceutical interventions, vaccine acceptance, family communication, and media literacy. So I'm just going to talk about media literacy for just a moment. Our media literacy messages were based on social cognitive theory and the Center for Media Literacy's core concepts and key questions. Our social media posts focused on 3 things: assessment of message credibility and quality, how to evaluate authorship. We talked about bots, what was the purpose of the message, and what was the construction. And we actually got into algorithms and really how social media works when we were talking about, when we were conducting our intervention. On the right is just an example of one of our posts about algorithms. We also focused on helping individuals determine information validity. We defined dis and misinformation. We examined images and provided examples such as deepfake videos, which were prominent actually during the pandemic, and also looked at and provided information on how to assess scientific evidence. Do you do lateral reading? Have you shared, have you looked at who is providing the evidence? And then we also, our third focus was on decision-making around sharing posts. So kind of what steps do you take when you share information with your friends and family? And I have to say that WHO also did some great work looking at these 3 elements during the pandemic. So just to wrap up then, that's kind of just some introductory remarks on what happened and how research has shown that media literacy can act as that cognitive shield, both for the long term and during the pandemic. My conclusions are that in our campaign, we found that we increased when we measured it 4 times, we increased self-perceived media literacy across all the information conditions. We think that our research supported the need for strategies to build this resilience for citizens through this skill and knowledge acquisition of media literacy. And the potential to teach it over social media is really encouraging. You can create messages quickly in response to misinformation. You can be very agile. We've developed strategies to respond and to rebut comments on social media. And we feel that we can provide the skills to help people access really credible health information. WHO and the US Surgeon General really recommend kind of follow in their assessment of COVID-19, really improving media, digital, and health literacy skills. My last comment is, and I've thought about this as I was kind of going through these remarks, is that these programs on social media also have the potential to reach millions of adults, literally, who have not had access to classroom or community-based programs. It gives us another channel to provide information to people who've just not had the opportunity for media literacy education. We can reach them over social media, and we can expand on efforts that have been initiated by WHO, and many individual countries have really taken the efforts to provide media literacy, particularly during the pandemic. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walkosz. You make such a great point that a lot of times when we talk about media literacy, people think we're talking about teaching children or teaching, high school students, college students, when adults are the hardest audience to reach. And sometimes that is the audience that needs to be reached the most, especially if they didn't have critical thinking education, media literacy education. I just wanted to take a sec to ask our first 2 speakers, as well as whoever would like to answer and comment. It's hard how to figure out how to trigger that fact-checking urge in people when they are consuming information. So how to empower audiences and citizens to operate in an ever-changing information environment, especially during a war, during a pandemic, when things change all the time, as well as that human factor of, an item of disinformation may have been created to harm people or to make money in many cases. But how do you how do you differentiate between the initial motivation to share something versus the follow-on sharing? So you have people who were sharing information, disinformation, that they thought was going to help people. Don't take the vaccine, you might die. Don't wear a mask, you'll asphyxiate yourself. So we had another comment from the audience about pre-bunking. So I think maybe Dr. Zekulic mentioned that. And that was kind of something that came out during the pandemic, is getting ahead of the narratives. Because if you're fact checking and you're debunking, you're already behind, you're running to catch up on things. So if you have any comments on this sort of pre-bunking strategy that either organizations, governments, or whoever can take, I'd love to hear about that.
So
Whoever.
I'll actually start with almost like a personal example. So my brother-in-law, their American family, his young hippie living in Hawaii, he went down the rabbit hole of every single conspiracy theory you can think of. And the part of a difficulty of talking like young 20s, typical, like, this is all wrong. The problem is that the moment any information comes from what we would consider reliable source, government, medical institution, that's false. That was automatic. So whoever speaks without authority is a part of the corrupt system. So anything that logically would be the right sources for those group of people are actually wrong sources. So the biggest thing we could do to address like some of those audiences is find who is a credible source for them that still can be reasoned with. And this is like a thin line, like finding influencers who are influencing, but are also willing to, find a way of communicating. And I think that was my main point. Like for us to just push information in our own language with our own mindset to them, it does not work. To those audiences, it did not work. Finding the way to talk to them in their language, with their mindset, with their, let's say, like, finding a way to what they see as the proof of conspiracy. How do you talk against it or put it in some sort of the construct, like basically, as stupid as it is sometimes, seriously address it. So for us, obviously, as an organization, we couldn't go down that all the way down that rabbit holes, but finding our centers of excellence, finding the experts who are actually willing to do this for us and engage and find those influencers who can then talk to them and help contain it, was something to do. I think I will only add one more thing. It's difference between push and pull information. For example, like whatever was happening, if we just post the answers on our website, it means that people will actually go there and look for it, which really, really rarely happens. Our ability to find a way to push information to them, to find a way is not just through you don't have to be the follower of NATO on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, Instagram, or it was finding those sources that are willing to repost on our behalf and enter that specific area. So pushing information to them, basically forcing them to see it, acknowledge it, even if though they will not maybe believe it and stuff, was still something that was extremely important to us, to find a way to the audiences that are not receptive just because we are big and we are owned by nations. So I would only add those 2 points. One is constantly altering our voices, our messages for all different audiences that we have to find. And then second, finding the intermediary who can actually push our content to those audiences in the language and the manner that they would be more receptive to.
That's such a great point too, because I've noticed, we all have friends, family, relatives that we've either as a surprise or not as a surprise going down these rabbit holes and posting interesting information. Is that fact checking label sometimes, this information has been deemed as false, is almost like a point of pride of aha, I found the thing. If they say this is wrong, then I know I'm on the right track, which is kind of the opposite of what you want to do. You want to increase the trust and protect citizens in that way. But Dr. Walkosz, any comments on that?
I totally agree with that, with Dr. Zekulic, and that is exactly what I was going to say, was to really understand your audience. And we know that during the pandemic, we had multiple audiences. So we had parents, young adults, older adults, and the messages often need to be tailored to those audiences. And what we did, just one example was that for the vaccine information, there's a lot of anti-vaccine information that comes to parents in the US. There's a huge anti-vax movement here. And so we tried to find mommy bloggers, people who communicate with parents and provide them with the information to share with their audiences about vaccine safety and almost pre-bunk the misinformation about the COVID vaccine. So again, understanding your audience is key, and then finding influencers, key informants in individual audiences is critical. And the same message doesn't work for everyone.
Exactly. And that's been the message of each webinar, is meeting people where they are, not
Exactly.
struggling to pull them to where you are, because everyone is in a different place and everyone is receptive to different information. So that's really key, isn't it? I wish there was just one panacea for everyone, but that's what makes this all so challenging. So
yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
And just one point is that we also, in almost all of our work, use an advisory board of that intended audience, to make sure that to make sure that all the messages come from that audience and that they would agree that that's the correct message for their peer group, that they're involved in it.
Good.
As far as meeting people where they are, my educational background is public diplomacy, and one of the number one pillars of it is listening. Before you create messages, before you decide who would be an influencer, you listen. And I find so often that people skip that step, that people assume they already know who that is. So that's just a point I wanted to make, where I think listening would be so important there.
Absolutely. Because just, telling people what you think is important for them is just, you're going to come up against a brick wall right away, most likely.
Or making assumptions about who they would listen to.
Right. Which, if you don't know, if you're not listening, then you don't know who they're going to be receptive to. Absolutely. All right. With that, let's go to Dr. Denisa-Liepniece with her experience and comments on pandemics.
Thank you, Monica. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar. And it's absolutely great pleasure to combine what you already told. But let me also metaphorically set the table with a few maybe new definitions, but absolutely relevant, I think, not only for my presentation, but for developing environment we are working with. So in NATO, you are discovering a separate human domain, and we can talk about cognitive dimension of informational environment, which includes physical or gadget-centric approach, cyber, which is data-centric approach, and the third dimension is cognitive or human-centric. It is about beliefs, norms, motivations, experiences, education, mental health, identities, and ideologies. Defining a person we are talking about, we can use also cognitive superiority, and a person described in a book on cognitive superiority by Harley III and Jobson as bio, psycho, socio, techno, and info being. So if we perceive a human as a bio, psycho, socio, techno, and info being, we should also design our media literacy activities to address possible vulnerabilities and challenges. And we are also talking about cognitive warfare, and let me use the following definition for cognitive warfare: controlling others' mental states and behaviors by manipulating environmental stimuli. And during pandemic, I had two excellent and interesting reports and research teams. The first one was on disinformation resilience in the Baltic states. We tried to understand the governmental approach. And at the very beginning, we thought that it will be the 1 year project, just in one survey and one series of in-depth interviews. But as pandemic just started, we understood that we can make it longitudinal. And we managed to come back to the same experts and within 1 year asked the same questions on their perception about ability of the Baltic countries to counter disinformation, what kind of threats do they see, etc. The second report I worked on was on media literacy activities, audiences, and also actors. The second report was in 6 countries, and I led this report in the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, plus Eastern European Partnership countries, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, countries with very specific experience, and especially Ukraine. And we managed to gather data on the age of full-scale Russian invasion, so to understand their preparedness. And by combining these 2 reports, one mainly on governmental response in the Baltic countries, and the second mainly focused on media literacy activities, I want to come up with 5 prospects. And I think that it is important for us to move from a news media-centric approach, and you also addressed it, that we need to talk about tiny groups who are avoiding news, who are fatigued from news media. And we need to focus on cognition. And that's why I invite you to talk and to think about cognitive resilience and the use of media literacy developed infrastructure to address incoming challenges and threats within this cognitive domain. And I think that we can talk about 5 prospects, as I already mentioned. The first one is developing of media literacy infrastructure to increase cognitive resilience. And this is media literacy as a matter of national security and multi-field cooperation. We definitely need this multi-field cooperation. And the current Russia's aggression in Ukraine leaves no doubt, without a delay, authorities from the Baltic countries should move to increase the cognitive resilience in the increased cross-sectoral cooperation. And we see examples how it is operated now. The second is media literacy in cognitive warfare, and you already mentioned it. It should be a system of monitoring and system of alert, so rapid alert. When you see a problem, you are addressing not only audiences, but if you are monitoring news environment, you are addressing those working with media literacy projects. So it is absolutely essential. And monitoring, when I'm talking about monitoring, and you also addressed already this issue, so this is not only monitoring of informational landscapes, but also monitoring of audiences, attitudes, behaviors, skills, and knowledge. And at the core of understanding developments in cognitive domain, it is crucial for increasing cognitive resilience also to involve these different stakeholders and to provide them this data, not only focused on news monitoring, but also focused on very fragmented, tiny, targeted analysis on audiences, micro-targeted audiences. The third one, media literacy actors should be perceived as a collective cognitive immune system. And this is one taking into account the example of Ukraine as well, and definitely is about decentralization of this immune system. So I think that we should consider or discuss further support of decentralization of media literacy activities, especially in lifelong learning projects, engaging with very different communities. And Dr. Zekulic already addressed it as when you are going to some specific agencies, when you want to reach a specific audience. And by cooperation, by close cooperation with this already established media literacy infrastructure, you can have access to this very specific targeted vulnerable audiences. For example, also people with disabilities, people in prison, etc. And the specific need discovered in all 6 countries is also double costs of projects due to linguistic diversity of audiences. So we need also to take into account this specific problem. The first prospect I want to address is revising the role of journalistic community. So we need to understand and we need to deal with media as with the first responders. And also they should be aware of negative effects. side effect. For example, when they become amplifiers of disinformation. And that's why I absolutely salute the question on pre-banking. So we know some new ideas how to work with disinformation, but we also have to have field research. We have to understand how to endorse journalists working with this specific topics. And the fifth one is future-oriented media literacy. And talking about this future-oriented media literacy, we have to understand complexity and connectivity of changing environment. So when you have youngsters, so some of them are already in virtual reality, some of them are using and communicate through virtual reality glasses, actually, by using these new meta tools. And we couldn't expect from this specific audience immediately interest towards news, but they already are using a lot of media. And what we know about youngsters, this media is mainly focused on entertainment. So this also is very needed a little bit to shift, at least in some countries. I don't know how it goes in other countries, but at least based on my research in these 6 countries, media literacy activities are designed mainly to deal with news, media-centric approach. And the shift to cognitive-centric approach, I think, will be very useful. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were able to bring everything together and have those recommendations that are so important. I mean, having government, businesses, education, as well as media on the same page working together. Otherwise, they are, they can be opposing to each other, and government moves a lot slower than business, and education also moves a little bit slower than business. So if you have media in charge of one aspect of this whole puzzle for media literacy, it can go a long way and kind of move everyone else along with it. So with that, any other questions? I know we had let's see.
If I just may add just one huge heads up and power to Solvita. For NATO, like we here at Allied Command and Transformation, we are envisioning the future of NATO for 20 years ahead. And we have so-called 5 warfighting development imperatives. And one of them is cognitive superiority. Obviously, importance of this domain and ability to act and impact inside the cognitive space, it's of absolute importance if we are to dominate and basically shape the world that we want anytime in the future. So I just want to again lend full support of NATO behind the concept and idea. We are working on it, but unless we are able to effectively operate and dominate and shape the cognitive space, we will fail as the alliance, no matter how capable of our weapons and ability to act and affect in the physical or cyberspaces. Only that. Well done.
Thank you. Joshua, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you a lot for having me. I have a question. I'm one of the international group who is responsible for dealing with the education system in the Middle East, especially now living in Egypt. Okay. And I see the situation around us that they want to apply the coding and the idea of using the technology everywhere, not only in the education system, everywhere, but that needs a huge amount of money to apply it, because they do not have a good infrastructure for using the technology in all these organizations in the health, in the education system, also in the military service, everywhere. They want to apply it in all these fields, but that needs a huge money, and also needs experts in this field to be aware of how can they apply in a proper way. For this, we want to discuss this idea about how can we help the third parties to use the technology in the right way and under our control to be aware of like using it for achieving the good things for the humanity, you know, and not destroying them. Thank you.
Yes, very interesting question. And money is unfortunately the biggest barrier for a lot of things. I think one of the things that we talk about at the Center for Media Literacy especially is that the basic pillars of media literacy are free, right? You can teach media literacy with a stick and a rock. You know, you can teach it with any sort of life experience, but getting it out there, getting it into schools, training journalists, training government folks, that's a huge amount of money that a lot of places don't have. So how do you, any of our participants can jump in and say how they're dealing with that, either budget wise or access wise.
What I observed, Monica, is really a critical situation with sustainability of media literacy related activities. And in the case of the Baltic countries, plus Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, the main agenda setter is donor, not government. So, of course, it's a little bit sad situation now for our countries, but donors are setting agenda in a media literacy environment. So just to give one example how critical it is.
Barb, any comments on that?
So I will just add 2 short points. Like, oh, sorry, Barbara, please go ahead. Like,
go ahead, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. So one would be that. So first, to put the funds over cognitive superiority, you need to know what builds it. And I think this is like one of the big things that is still fundamentally missing. For us, again, within the NATO now, looking not publicly, in order to do that, first we need to have ability to have a improved situational awareness, to basically understand what is the baseline and how things change from this baseline. What is the normal mindsets? When are those starting to alternate because of the information or being pushed to them? So that situational awareness is one first prerequisite. And we don't have it yet. We don't have a baselines for everything that really matters. Mm-hmm. Second part is net assessment. And this is net assessment kind of like us versus them. A lot of times we're trying to apply our own mindset, our own way of thinking on the different audiences. And we mentioned that before, but we don't have enough information to actually truly understand the mindset and the logic systems of those alternate audiences. This is a program of work. It's one of our capabilities that we're developing that we're still not there. We still constantly, when we think we are biased by our own mindsets in our societies, and therefore mentioning the Middle East or Near East, we are struggling to understand how the audience is there actually reason and process and logic. So that's the net assessment thing that we are still not there, but we are building. The last but not least is information environment assessment, but as a key capability. We're able to do open source analysis, the surfaces, but how do you actually go into the deep web, see all of the structures that go from that are basically being dragged through the invisible sides and then just pushed out. Those are the parts we still do not see. We are trying to build our capabilities now, like very, very, very enhanced search tools, for the lack of a better word, just to be able to see, track, and trace. But we are aware that what we actually see through all of our, like I say, open source information, media analysis is the top of the iceberg. And our ability to penetrate behind the curtains and see where it goes, we know it's there, but we just can't see it. But that's something that needs to develop. So to be very honest, we are putting a lot of money into it, but we're still not there. And we are not there, like I say, because the critical prerequisites to be able to operate in the cognitive space with some sort of a depth, strategy, and fidelity, it's still not there. We're still like under development. And don't quote me on this, but I think it will be a while before we are really, really comfortable deliberately tailoring, targeting, and operating in that space.
Sure. Barb, did you have something to add to that too?
Well, yes, and thank you, Dr. Zekulic, for the kind of overview of really what the situation truly is. I would say, and thank you, Joshua, for your question. I would say in the interim that we are in right now, and with lack of resources that you mentioned, maybe one approach, and I've seen read what other countries have done, is really to take small steps, community-based approaches. Who are the key actors in your area? Can you provide the information to them? As Monica said, the Center for Media Literacy resources are free and available. Are there ways to disseminate that information to your community-based groups, to teachers, to start a small effort, movement around media literacy and those resources to get that information out? Solvita said that donors are really contributing. How can you set the agenda? Is there some way to move forward in that way with lack of resources? Because that's a major problem globally. And there needs to be a way to kind of systematically address how we take those first steps.
Right, and who should be paying for it? Should it be a government? Should it be an
Right.
individual organization? And we're running out of time, but there was an interesting question of how is NATO involved in education, either media literacy or otherwise, whether it's school children or adult education? Like, is that something that NATO has a hand in? Dr. Zekulic.
So not directly, I mean, indirectly, yes, through supporting such events such as yours, or to being very engaged in the what we call the public diplomacy, speaking to everybody who is willing to hear us, but it's still quite passive approach, I would say. We do not go actively inside the education system to do this. We're a little bit better when it comes to taking information, misinformation, disinformation in part of the military schooling as a part of what we call the counter and hybrid warfare. We are a little bit more proactive in that. That is like one of the mandatory curriculums in all of the military schools, war colleges, and stuff like that. So we have a little bit bigger space there. But like I said, unfortunately, I do not see it as something deliberate, coherent, and transparent that we do. So we're happy to provide capabilities and money, but it's not something we would proactively do, which is, right. I would admittedly take up.
Right. And it could be received in so many different ways. Military organizations directing education could be seen as, not a positive thing, even if it has positive results. So unfortunately, we could go all day, but we do have to stop. I do want to just quickly thank everyone for being here, as well as to promote just briefly Wednesday's webinar on education systems. So perfect segue, media literacy building, foundational skills for democracies today and in the future, with 3 amazing speakers as well. So I hope you all will be able to join us on Wednesday, and our last webinar will be on Friday of this week as well. So thank you again to all of our speakers, to our audience members. We will be sending out a link to this recording. If you missed some of it, it will be on YouTube hopefully later today, and we can send that out to everyone as well. And with that, I think we can end the webinar and stop recording.